We assume that history is a straight line. We assume that the past is set in stone, recorded in books, and archived in museums. But what if there are gaps in that line? What if there are events so terrifying, so fundamentally wrong, that the people in power didn't just hide them, they erased them? Welcome to the story of Project Somnium. Before we begin, I must issue a warning. The details you are about to hear regarding human experimentation, psychological torture, and biological alteration are graphic. They are based on the recovered audio logs of Dr. Elias Vance, a man who technically did not exist in any government database after 1972. To understand the horror of the sleep room, we first have to understand the fear that built it. The year was 1971. The Cold War was freezing the world into a state of constant paranoia. The United States and the Soviet Union were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for the human mind. The CIA had already launched MKUltra, attempting to use LSD to control behavior. But deep within the Pentagon, a darker theory was brewing. The theory was simple: sleep is the enemy. A soldier who sleeps is vulnerable. A spy who dreams can be interrogated. If the United States could cure the biological need for sleep, they would have an army that could march for weeks without stopping. They would have agents who could monitor the enemy 24 hours a day, forever. This was the birth of Project Somnium. The location was chosen for its isolation, Site 9. A decommissioned nuclear missile silo buried 200 feet beneath the frozen forests of North Dakota. It was a place designed to survive the apocalypse, making it the perfect coffin for what was about to happen. The lead researcher was Dr. Elias Vance. Vance was a brilliant neuroscientist, but he was obsessed with the idea of the collective unconscious, the theory that all human minds are connected by a hidden network, and that sleep is just a barrier preventing us from accessing it. He didn't just want to create sleepless soldiers, he wanted to unlock the godlike potential of the human brain. But to do that, he needed guinea pigs. The subjects were not volunteers, not truly. They were the ghosts of society. 5 men were selected from the federal penitentiary system, individuals on death row or serving life sentences without parole. They were offered a deal that sounded too good to be true: participate in a 30-day isolation experiment, and upon completion, their sentences would be commuted. They would be free men. Let us look at who these men were, because understanding them is key to understanding the nightmare they unleashed. Subject 1 was Thomas Miller, a former Vietnam veteran dishonorably discharged. He was a man of violence, hardened by war, skeptical, and physically imposing. He was the natural leader of the group. Subject 2 was Artie Pines, a con artist and a forger, a small, nervous man who relied on his charm to survive. He was the voice of reason, or so he thought. Subject 3 remains nameless in the files, referred to only as the Silent One. He was a towering figure, incarcerated for a crime so brutal the files remain redacted. He rarely spoke, observing the world with cold, detached eyes. Subject 4 was the anomaly. His name was Julian. He wasn't a criminal in the violent sense, he was a former cult leader. He had been arrested for distributing hallucinogens and preaching about the Great Awakening. Dr. Vance chose him specifically because Julian claimed he had already trained himself to go days without sleep during his meditation rituals. And Subject 5 was a young drifter named Davy. He was only 22 years old, caught in a stolen car across state lines. He was scared, naive, and completely unprepared for the hell that awaited him. On November 14, 1971, these 5 men were escorted down the elevator shaft into the belly of the earth. They were stripped, examined, and given gray jumpsuits. Then they were led into the chamber. The chamber was a marvel of engineering, a sealed, lead-lined room furnished with 5 cots, a table, chairs, a bookshelf, and a bathroom blocked off by a privacy curtain. There were no windows. The only connection to the outside world was a thick 5-inch pane of reinforced glass, a one-way mirror where Dr. Vance and the military observers sat. But the most important feature of the room was the air vents. Through these vents, the scientists pumped a mixture of oxygen and a classified chemical agent known as compound zeta. It was an experimental stimulant, a gas designed to block the adenosine receptors in the brain, making it chemically impossible for the subjects to feel tired. The door hissed shut. The heavy iron wheel was turned, locking them in. Day 1, Dr. Vance recorded into his tape recorder. The gas is live. The subjects are exploring the room. Vitals are normal. The experiment has begun. For the first 72 hours, everything was remarkably normal. This is often called the honeymoon phase of sleep deprivation. The gas worked. The subjects felt energized, euphoric even. They spent the time getting to know each other. Miller told war stories. Arties showed Davy card tricks. Even Julian, the cultist, seemed pleasant, sitting in the corner humming a low tone. They knew they were being watched, and they performed for the cameras. They joked about what they would do with their freedom. Davy talked about seeing his mother again. Miller talked about buying a motorcycle and riding to the coast. It was tragic, really, because looking back at the footage now, we know that none of them would ever see the sun again. The first sign that something was wrong appeared on day 4. It wasn't a biological shift, it was an atmospheric one. The microphones inside the room began to pick up a sound. It was very faint, a low-frequency hum hovering around 18 Hz. This is known as the ghost frequency, a sound wave just below human hearing that can cause feelings of dread and anxiety. The engineers checked the ventilation fans. They checked the power generators. Everything was silent. The sound wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from the subjects themselves. Or rather, it was vibrating around them. On day 5, the conversation stopped. The camaraderie that had built up over the first few days evaporated overnight. The subjects stopped sitting together at the table. They retreated to their cots. They began to pace. Pacing is a common symptom of anxiety, but this was different. Subject 3, the silent one, walked in a perfect circle in the center of the room for 6 hours straight. He didn't left or right. He just walked. His footsteps fell into a rhythm that matched the beating of a human heart. Thump, 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 thump. Dr. Vance noted in his journal, the subjects are exhibiting signs of hyper-awareness. They are reacting to stimuli that we cannot see. Subject 2, Artie, keeps brushing his shoulder as if shooing away a fly. There are no insects in the chamber. Then came day 6, the day the reality filter began to crack. The human brain is a filter. It takes in millions of bits of information every second, sights, sounds, smells, and it filters out 99% of them so we can focus on survival. Sleep allows the brain to reset these filters, but without sleep, the filters degrade. The brain starts to let everything in. Miller was the first to speak about it. He walked up to the one-way mirror. He pressed his face against the glass. His eyes, usually sharp and defiant, were now wide and rimmed with red. His pupils were dilated so much that his eyes appeared almost entirely black. "Doc," Miller whispered, his voice cracking over the intercom, "you need to fix the air." Dr. Vance pressed the button on his console. "The air is optimal, Subject 1. Are you having difficulty breathing?" "No," Miller replied, not breaking eye contact with his own reflection. "It's not the oxygen, it's the dust. The dust is organized." "Explain," Vance demanded. "The dust motes," Miller said, pointing a trembling finger at the empty air. "They are floating in patterns. They are making faces. Can't you see them? They are screaming." Vance looked at the other researchers. They dismissed it as a hallucination, a classic side effect of amphetamines. But Julian, the cultist, looked up from his corner. He wasn't looking at the dust. He was looking at Miller, and he was smiling. "He's starting to tune in," Julian said softly. By day 8, a paranoia had set in fully. The subjects became convinced that the researchers were plotting to kill them. They started whispering to each other, cupping their hands over their mouths so the microphones couldn't pick up their words. They dismantled the legs of the table to use as crude clubs, holding them as they huddled in the corner. But who were they protecting themselves from? The researchers couldn't get in. The door was sealed. Davy, the young kid, was the first to break psychologically. He began to weep uncontrollably. He sat on his cot, rocking back and forth, clutching his head. "I can hear the walls," Davy sobbed. "The pipes, they are talking about me. They know my name. How do the pipes know my middle name?" Dr. Vance increased the dosage of compound zeta. He believed that if he stimulated their brains further, they might push past the paranoia into a state of clarity. It was a fatal mistake. On the night of day 9, If the first 10 days were a descent into madness, the next phase was a collision with reality itself. By day 11, the experiment at Site 9 had shifted from a medical study to a containment situation. The subjects were no longer behaving like human beings. They had stopped engaging in small talk. They had stopped playing cards. They moved with a predatory efficiency, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. Dr. Vance and Colonel H made a decision that would seal the fate of everyone involved. They decided to cut the supply of compound zeta. The hypothesis was standard. The subjects were addicted to the stimulant gas. If the gas was removed, they would crash. Their bodies would force them into a coma, resetting their brain chemistry. It was a logical medical assumption. But logic has no place in the Somnium. On the morning of day 12, the vents hissed shut. The flow of the stimulant stopped. Fresh, unadulterated oxygen was pumped into the room. The researchers watched the monitors, waiting for the subjects to collapse. They expected lethargy. They expected sleep. Instead, they got chaos. Within 10 minutes of the gas being cut, the chamber erupted. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was instantaneous panic. All 5 subjects began to scream. But they weren't screaming in pain, they weren't screaming for food or water. They were screaming for the gas. Subject 2, Artie, ran to the reinforced door and began slamming his head against it. Thud, thud, thud. He hit it so hard that the skin on his forehead split open, smearing blood on the steel, but he didn't stop. "Turn it back on," he shrieked, his voice shredding his vocal cords. "Don't let me close my eyes. Please, God, don't let me blink." Dr. Vance keyed the intercom. Subject 2, cease this behavior immediately. Lie down and rest. Subject 1, Miller, the hardened war veteran, looked up at the camera. He was weeping. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the grime on his cheeks. "You don't understand, Doctor," Miller sobbed. "The gas, it keeps the fog away. If we sleep, he gets in." The thermal monitors flared again. That cold spot, the 6th entity in the room, was growing. Without the gas keeping the subjects' brains in a hyperactive state, their mental defenses were crumbling. The entity was moving faster now, darting between the men like a shark in a tank. Subject 5, the young kid Davy, was cornered by the invisible presence. On the camera, Davy looked like he was being pressed against the wall by a strong wind. His face was contorted in sheer terror. He was swatting at the air, begging someone to get the fingers out of his brain. Colonel H, realizing the situation was spiraling, ordered the gas to be turned back on. Not out of mercy, but out of fear that the subjects would kill themselves before the 30 days were up. The moment the hissing sound returned to the vents, the screaming stopped. Instantly. The subjects stood up. They wiped the blood from their faces. They returned to their positions in the room as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. They were no longer afraid of the entity. They had accepted it. They began to whisper to it. Day 15, the Ides of March for Project Somnium. This is the day detailed in the red file, the section of the report that remains classified to this day. I will describe it as accurately as the leaked transcripts allow. Around 0200 hours, the subjects gathered in the center of the room. They had found a loose metal spring from the underside of one of the cots. It was sharp, rusted, and jagged. They didn't use it to attack the door. They didn't use it to attack each other. Subject 4, Julian, took the metal spring. He sat down calmly on the floor. Subject 3, the silent one, sat in front of him. Without anesthesia, without a flinch, Julian began to operate on Subject 3. The goal was simple. They were terrified of blinking. They were terrified that in the split second their eyes were closed, the watchers would move closer. So, they decided to remove the obstacle. They removed their eyelids. I will spare you the visceral sound of the procedure, though it exists on the tapes. What is more disturbing is the silence. Subject 3 did not scream. He did not struggle. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, while his eyelids were surgically excised with a rusty piece of metal. When it was done, Subject 3 turned his face to the camera. His eyes were now permanently wide, unblinking, staring forever into the abyss. Blood ran down his cheeks like red tears. He smiled. One by one, they all did it. It was a ritual, a baptism. By the time the sun rose on day 16, 5 pairs of lidless eyes were staring up at the observation deck. Dr. Vance vomited. The military police guarding the door refused to look at the monitors. The subjects were no longer human. They were biological antennas, tuned to a frequency that we are not meant to hear. From day 16 to day 20, the laws of physics inside the chamber began to degrade. The microphones picked up voices that were not coming from the subjects. It sounded like a radio tuning between stations, snippets of news broadcasts from the future, songs that hadn't been written yet, and conversations in dead languages. Subject 4, Julian, became the mouthpiece. He would stand in the center of the room, vibrating. Yes, vibrating. The high-speed cameras showed that his body was shaking at a microscopic level, blurring his outline. He began to speak. "We are the static," Julian announced to the empty room. "We are the space between the atoms. Dr. Vance, your wife is thinking about leaving you. She is packing a blue suitcase right now. She is hiding money in the coffee tin." Dr. Vance froze. He grabbed the phone and dialed his home. There was no answer. He later confirmed that his wife had indeed left him that morning, taking a blue suitcase. How could Julian know? There was no communication with the outside world. "We see everything," Julian whispered. "Time is a circle. We are standing in the center." Then came day 25, the vanishing. The facility's power generator experienced a catastrophic surge. For 60 seconds, Site 9 went dark. The magnetic locks on the chamber held firm, but the cameras and lights cut out. In the pitch blackness, the audio recorders were the only things still running on emergency batteries. They captured a sound that defies explanation. It wasn't human. It sounded like thousands of wet wings flapping at once. A massive flock of birds, or perhaps insects, filling the small room. The sound was deafening. Flap, flap, flap. Over the noise, you could hear the subjects. They weren't screaming anymore. They were laughing. It was a joyous, ecstatic laughter. "Take us," Davy screamed. "Open the door. The sky is inside the room." Then a loud electrical crack, like thunder, shook the bunker. The emergency generators kicked in. The lights flickered back on. The hum of the ventilation returned. Dr. Vance and the team looked at the monitors, expecting to see carnage. Instead, they saw emptiness. 3 of the subjects were gone. Subject 2, Artie, Subject 3, the silent one, and Subject 5, Davy, had vanished. The door was sealed. The airlock was untouched. There were no tunnels, no hidden exits. The room was a steel box buried under tons of rock. Yet 3 grown men had simply ceased to exist in 3-dimensional space. But they left something behind. In the center of the room, neatly folded in piles, were their gray jumpsuits, their underwear, their socks. Even the metal spring they had used for surgery was placed on top of one of the piles. It was as if they had been raptured, as if their physical bodies were no longer needed where they were going. Only 2 subjects remained, Subject 1, Miller, and Subject 4, Julian. They stood with their backs to the wall, as far away from each other as possible. But they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at the piles of clothes. Miller was shaking. He looked terrified again. The bravado was gone. "Where did they go?" Dr. Vance asked over the intercom, his voice trembling. "Subject 1, report. Where are the others?" Miller slowly looked up. His lidless eyes were dry and red. He pointed a finger at the wall behind him. "They didn't go anywhere, Doctor," Miller whispered. "They are right here. They just woke up. We are the ones who are still asleep." Dr. Vance looked at the wall Miller was pointing at. At first, he saw nothing. Then he adjusted the contrast on the monitor. There, burned into the concrete wall, were 3 shadows, scorch marks in the shape of human beings. They were frozen in poses of agony, arms outstretched, mouths open in a silent scream. The shadows were moving. Not the shadows cast by the light, the scorch marks themselves. They were writhing on the wall, trapped in the 2-dimensional surface, trying to claw their way back out. This was the end of the experiment as a scientific endeavor. It was no longer about sleep. It was about survival. But Colonel H would not let it end. He saw weapon potential. He saw teleportation. He ordered the experiment to continue to day 30. He ordered the extraction team, Blue Squad, to prepare for entry. He didn't know it yet, but he was signing their death warrants, because whatever had taken the other 3 was still hungry. We have now reached the final chapter of the Somnium logs. If you have listened this far, you are no longer just an observer. You are a witness. By day 30, Site 9 had ceased to be a research facility. It had become a tomb with a heartbeat. The 2 remaining subjects, Miller and Julian, had not moved from their positions in 48 hours. They stood amidst the piles of clothes left behind by the vanished men. They didn't speak, they didn't blink. Their lidless eyes were fixed on a point in space that the cameras couldn't see. Dr. Vance begged to terminate the experiment remotely. He proposed flooding the chamber with nitrogen gas, ending the subject's suffering instantly and humanely. He argued that these men were no longer compatible with life on Earth. But Colonel H refused. The military mind does not see suffering, it sees assets. He believed that the subjects had achieved a state of quantum phasing, the ability to exist in 2 places at once. He wanted that power. He wanted to weaponize the ghost. At 8 a.m. on December 14, 1971, Colonel H authorized the deployment of Blue Team. Blue Team was an elite extraction unit, 5 men trained for biological and radioactive hazard containment. They were heavily armed, wearing full-body hazardous material suits and lead-lined helmets. Their orders were specific: breach the airlock, sedate the 2 targets using high-potency ketamine darts, and strap them to gurneys for transport to a secure facility in Nevada. It was a standard extraction operation. It should have taken 5 minutes. It lasted exactly 90 seconds. We know what happened because of the audio feed from Sergeant K, the team leader. This transcript was recovered from the burned wreckage of the control room years later. The heavy iron wheel of the blast door turned. Clank, clank, clank. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air. As the door swung open, the first thing the soldiers noticed wasn't the subjects. It was the smell. Sergeant K reported that the air inside the chamber didn't smell like a confined space. It smelled like ozone and burnt hair, mixed with the distinct copper scent of electricity. The team moved in. Flashlights cut through the gloom. Visual on targets, Sergeant K reported. They are standing in the center. They are glowing. The cameras confirmed this. Miller and Julian were emitting a faint bioluminescent light, a pale blue aura that pulsed in rhythm with the hum of the ventilation. "Get on the ground," the sergeant ordered. "Comply or we will engage." The subjects didn't flinch. Julian, the cultist, slowly turned his head toward the soldiers. His face was a mask of serene terror. He looked at the heavily armed men not as threats, but as children interrupting a funeral. "You are late," Julian said. His voice was distorted, sounding like it was coming from inside the soldiers' own helmets rather than from his mouth. "The door is already open." "Fire the tranquilizers," Sergeant K shouted. 3 soldiers fired simultaneously. The darts flew true. They should have impacted the subjects' chests. But they didn't. The darts passed through Miller and Julian as if they were holograms. They sailed through their bodies and clattered against the far wall. "Malfunction," a soldier screamed. "They aren't solid. My rounds went right through them." Then the physics of the room collapsed. The cold spot, the invisible entity that had been watching them for 30 days, manifested. It didn't look like a ghost. It looked like a tear in the fabric of reality. A jagged black rift opened in the corner of the room, sucking in the light. Miller, the war veteran, looked at the rift and smiled. "It's time to wake up." Suddenly, gravity in the room inverted. The soldiers were lifted off their feet, slamming into the ceiling. The heavy steel cots, the table, the piles of clothes, everything fell upward. The audio feed from this moment is a cacophony of panic, men screaming, bones snapping, and the deafening sound of wind, a wind that was blowing from inside the rift. "Help me, it's pulling me apart," one soldier yelled. "My hand, look at my hand." The camera on that soldier's helmet showed his hand dissolving into dust, turning into a stream of particles that flowed into the black rift. He wasn't dying, he was being unmade. Sergeant K aimed his rifle at Julian. "Stop it! Make it stop!" Julian floated toward the sergeant, hovering inches above the ceiling, which was now the floor. He leaned in close to the sergeant's faceplate. "We are not the ones doing this," Julian said gently. "You are just dreaming us, and now the alarm is ringing." The feed cut to static, a final high-pitched electronic squeal that blew out the speakers in the observation deck. Then, silence. When the backup team arrived an hour later, they found the door open. They looked inside. The room was empty. No subjects, no blue team, no equipment. Even the scorch marks on the wall were gone. The room was pristine, scrubbed clean of all matter. It was as if no one had ever been there. The only thing left was a single object, sitting in the center of the floor. It was Sergeant K's helmet. The visor was crushed from the inside out. The military panicked. Colonel H ordered the immediate sterilization of the site. Tons of wet concrete were poured into the shaft, sealing the bunker forever. The files were burned. The families of the soldiers were paid off and told their sons died in a training accident involving a gas leak. Project Somnium was erased from history. Dr. Elias Vance was the only survivor who knew the truth. He was discharged and threatened with treason if he ever spoke a word. But silence couldn't save him. Dr. Vance spent the next 40 years running. He moved from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a month. He developed a crippling phobia of sleep. He would force himself to stay awake for days, terrified that if he drifted off, he would find himself back in that room. He died in a nursing home in 2011. The cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by extreme exhaustion. But the nurse on duty told a different story. She said that in his final moments, Dr. Vance wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the empty corner of his hospital room. He was screaming, "Turn on the lights! They are coming through the wall! Don't let me blink!" And when he finally died, when his heart stopped, the lights in the entire hospital flickered and went out for exactly 60 seconds. That should have been the end of the story. But horror doesn't end. It just waits. This brings us to 2024. Last month, a digital urban explorer known online as Alex V managed to triangulate the location of Site 9 using old satellite maps and leaked geological surveys. He hiked into the frozen woods of North Dakota looking for a ghost story. He found a rusted ventilation pipe sticking out of the ground, half buried in snow. Alex didn't try to enter. He knew better. Instead, he lowered a high-fidelity parabolic microphone down the shaft. He lowered it 500 feet past the concrete plug down into the hollow spaces that still existed around the old bunker. He expected to hear wind, maybe water dripping. He was wrong. The audio file he uploaded to a private server before he disappeared is the only proof we have that Project Somnium never ended. If you listen to the recording, you can hear it clearly. It sounds like a party. You can hear the clinking of glasses, you can hear the shuffling of cards, and you can hear voices. Not screaming, laughing. You can hear Miller's deep, gravelly laugh. You can hear Julian humming that strange tune. And underneath it all, you can hear the voices of Blue Team. They aren't in pain anymore. They sound accepted. "Your turn, Sergeant," a voice whispers on the tape. "Deal the cards. We have eternity to play." They are still down there, trapped in a pocket of time where sleep doesn't exist. They are wide awake, waiting for someone to open the door again. And this is the most terrifying part. Dr. Vance wrote his final journal entry that the Somnium is not a place. It is a frequency. It is a signal. And by listening to this story, by visualizing that room, by picturing those lidless eyes, you have just tuned your brain to that frequency. You might feel fine now, but tonight, when you turn off the lights and the house settles, pay attention to the silence. If you hear a low humming sound, like a ventilation fan running in the distance, do not investigate it. Do not look at the corners of your room. Just close your eyes, cover your head, and pray that when you fall asleep, you are the only one inside your dreams. Good night.